When Margaret Thompson demanded my 3-week-old baby be kicked off the plane for disrupting other passengers, she had no idea she'd just humiliated a pilot's wife. My son Miguel wasn't even crying, he was sleeping peacefully. But Karen's connections got us removed anyway. She picked the wrong family to mess with. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching, also like and subscribe for more stories. Sarah Martinez clutched her 3-week-old son Miguel closer to her chest as she walked down the narrow airplane aisle. The tiny baby was wrapped in a soft blue blanket that her mother had knitted during those long months of waiting. This was their first flight together from Chicago to Phoenix to introduce Miguel to his father's family. Captain David Martinez, her husband of 2 years and one of the airline's most experienced pilots, was already in Phoenix preparing for his next international flight. As someone who had flown this route hundreds of times, David knew every detail of the journey, but today was special. Today, his son would be on one of his airline's flights for the first time. Sarah found her seat in row 12, window side. She had specifically chosen this seat so she could look out at the clouds and imagine David up in the cockpit of another plane, commanding similar aircraft through the sky. As she settled in with her diaper bag and Miguel's supplies, the baby remained peacefully asleep in his soft blanket. The other passengers were boarding slowly, families with children, business travelers checking their phones, elderly couples discussing their vacation plans. Sarah smiled at a little girl who waved at her from across the aisle. Everything seemed perfect for their first mother-son adventure. Then she appeared. Margaret Maggie Thompson, known throughout her Scottsdale HOA community simply as Karen, stomped down the aisle with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed her everything. At 52, she had perfected the art of making everyone around her miserable wherever she went. Her perfectly styled blonde bob didn't move as she turned her head sharply, scanning the seats like a predator looking for weakness. She wore a designer blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, carried an expensive handbag, and had the kind of fake smile that never reached her cold blue eyes. Behind her, her husband Frank followed quietly, looking embarrassed and defeated, a man who had learned long ago that resistance to his wife's demands was futile. Maggie's seat was in row 11, directly in front of Sarah and Miguel. As she approached, her eagle eyes immediately locked onto the sleeping baby like a hawk spotting prey. "Oh, perfect," she muttered loud enough for half the plane to hear, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "A crying baby. This is exactly what I needed for my vacation." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She looked down at Miguel, who was still sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. He hadn't made a single sound since boarding, not even the soft coos that newborns sometimes make. "Excuse me," Maggie said, turning to face Sarah with that practiced fake smile that she used when she wanted something. "How old is that baby?" 3 weeks, Sarah replied softly, hoping to keep her voice low so as not to wake her precious son. Maggie's eyes widened in theatrical horror, as if Sarah had just confessed to bringing a wild animal on board. 3 weeks? You brought a 3-week-old baby on an airplane? Do you have any idea how irresponsible that is? Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "My doctor said it was fine. We need to visit family and—" "I don't care what your doctor said," Maggie snapped, her voice rising and causing other passengers to look over. "That baby is going to scream for 3 hours and ruin everyone's flight. Some people are so incredibly selfish." Other passengers were starting to stare now. Sarah felt the weight of their gazes and pulled Miguel closer protectively. A few people seemed sympathetic to her situation, but others were already looking annoyed, as if they expected the worst based solely on Maggie's dramatic proclamations. "Ma'am, my baby is sleeping. He's been very quiet since we boarded," Sarah said, trying desperately to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Oh, they're always quiet until they're not," Maggie said with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "I've raised 3 children of my own. I know exactly how this goes. First, they start with little whimpers, then it escalates to full-blown screaming. Before you know it, the whole plane is miserable because one person decided to be selfish and inconsiderate." As more passengers settled into their seats and stowed their luggage, Maggie's complaints grew louder and more dramatic. She seemed to feed off the attention, turning to address anyone who would listen to her grievances. "Can you believe this?" she announced to the surrounding rows. "A 3-week-old baby on a plane. When I was a young mother, we didn't travel with infants. We had respect for other people and consideration for fellow passengers." An elderly man in the row behind Sarah leaned forward, his weathered face showing concern. "Ma'am, the baby isn't even crying. Maybe you could give the young mother a chance before assuming the worst." Maggie whirled around to face him, her eyes flashing with indignation. Are you going to pay for my vacation if it's ruined by constant screaming? I paid good money for this seat, and I shouldn't have to listen to a screaming infant for 3 hours straight. Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. This was supposed to be a special day, Miguel's first flight, her reunion with David's family in Phoenix, a chance to show off their beautiful new baby. Instead, it was turning into a nightmare of public humiliation. Flight attendant Jessica approached with her professional smile, her uniform crisp and her demeanor trained to handle difficult situations. Is everything okay here? I heard some raised voices. Maggie immediately launched into her complaint with renewed vigor. This woman brought a newborn baby onto the plane, and I'm concerned about the disruption to other passengers. I demand she be moved to the back of the aircraft or removed entirely. This is going to ruin the peaceful flight experience for everyone. Jessica looked at Sarah with kind, understanding eyes. Ma'am, is your baby currently bothering other passengers? He's been sleeping the whole time, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper as she fought back tears. He hasn't made any noise at all. The baby hasn't made a single sound, confirmed the elderly man behind them, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough injustice in his lifetime. Jessica nodded professionally. Well then, there doesn't seem to be any issue at the moment. Ma'am, she addressed Maggie, if you'd like to change seats, I can certainly see what's available, but the mother and baby have every right to be here and haven't caused any disturbance. Maggie's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is discrimination. I'm being discriminated against because I'm standing up for passengers' rights. I want to speak to your supervisor immediately. Ma'am, please lower your voice. You're actually disturbing other passengers more than the baby is, Jessica said firmly but politely, maintaining her professional composure. That was absolutely the wrong thing to say to someone like Maggie Thompson. Don't you dare tell me to lower my voice. Maggie shrieked, her composure completely shattered. I want to speak to your supervisor right now. I want this baby removed from the plane immediately. The entire airplane had gone uncomfortably quiet now. Even the passengers still boarding in the aisle stopped to see what was happening. Sarah felt like she was under a harsh spotlight, being judged by everyone around her for simply existing with her baby. Miguel stirred slightly in his sleep, making a tiny sound, not crying or fussing, just the soft, innocent coo that newborns make when they're dreaming. To most people it would have been adorable. To Maggie it was vindication. See, it's starting. I told you all this would happen, she announced triumphantly, as if she had predicted a natural disaster. Sarah began to gently rock Miguel, and he settled back into peaceful sleep immediately, his little face serene and undisturbed by the chaos around him. Supervisor Linda arrived at the scene, her expression serious as she assessed the situation. Maggie immediately began her demands again, this time even more aggressively and with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. I want that baby off this plane right now. It's a health hazard, it's disruptive to paying customers, and it's ruining my vacation. If you don't remove them immediately, I'm going to sue this airline for everything it's worth and make sure this story goes viral on every social media platform. Linda looked at Sarah, then at the perfectly quiet baby sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, then back at Maggie's red, angry face. Ma'am, I don't see any issue here. The infant appears to be well-behaved and the mother seems very responsible. Well-behaved? It's 3 weeks old. It doesn't know how to behave. Maggie's voice rose to near hysteria. And look at her, she's probably one of those young mothers who doesn't know what she's doing. That baby could start screaming any second and then what? We're all trapped up here with her poor parenting skills. The cruelty of those words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over. She was 26 years old, married, and had planned this pregnancy carefully with her husband. She had read every parenting book, taken classes, and prepared meticulously for motherhood. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I just want to see my husband's family. I'm not trying to cause problems for anyone. But Maggie was far from finished with her attack. Oh, now she's crying too, Maggie announced to the entire plane with mock sympathy. Great, now we have a crying mother and a baby that's about to start screaming. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent from happening. She turned back to Linda with the confidence of someone who had perfected the art of getting her way through intimidation. I am a Gold Premier member of this airline. I fly this route 6 times a year for business and pleasure. I spend thousands of dollars annually with your company. If you don't remove this disruption immediately, I will make sure everyone knows how poorly this airline treats its valuable, loyal customers. Linda was clearly torn between company policy and the desire to calm the increasingly volatile situation. Ma'am, let me see what I can do. Perhaps we can find alternative seating arrangements that would be satisfactory to everyone involved. No, Maggie said firmly, crossing her arms like a petulant child. I don't want alternative arrangements. I want them off the plane entirely. That baby doesn't belong here in the first place. Look at her, she's too young to be a mother anyway. Probably some irresponsible teenager who got herself pregnant and now thinks the world should accommodate her poor life choices. The cruelty and inaccuracy of those words hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. She was holding her 3-week-old son, the most precious thing in her world, while a complete stranger attacked everything about her life, her character, and her fitness as a mother. A retired Air Force colonel named George Patterson stood up from his seat several rows behind them. He wore a simple polo shirt, but something about his bearing and the steel in his voice commanded immediate respect. "Ma'am, you are completely out of line," he said to Maggie, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat. "That young woman is traveling with her child, which is perfectly legal and completely normal. Your behavior, however, is disturbing every single person on this aircraft." Maggie sized him up quickly, looking for weakness and finding none. "And who are you exactly?" "Another bleeding heart liberal who thinks crying babies belong on airplanes." "I'm a retired colonel in the United States Air Force," he said quietly, "and I've seen real problems in my life. A sleeping baby isn't one of them. Your behavior, however, is completely unacceptable." But Maggie was beyond reason now, intoxicated by the attention and the power she felt in controlling the situation. "I don't care if you're the President of the United States," Maggie declared dramatically. "I paid for a peaceful flight and I'm going to get one. Either that baby goes or I'm calling the police when we land. I'll file complaints with the FAA, the Better Business Bureau, and every travel website on the internet. This airline will regret the day they chose a crying baby over a loyal customer." She turned back to Linda with an ultimatum. "You have exactly 5 minutes to remove them from this plane, or I'm going to make this the worst day of your career and the worst publicity nightmare this airline has ever experienced." Linda looked helplessly at Sarah, knowing that company policy was clear: paying passengers couldn't be removed without legitimate cause, and a quiet baby wasn't cause. But Maggie's threats were real, and dealing with her complaints and potential media attention would be an absolute nightmare for everyone involved. "Ma'am, let me talk to the captain about this situation," Linda said finally, clearly hoping that someone with more authority could resolve the impossible situation. Sarah's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. Maybe the captain would have the authority to put an end to this madness. She had no idea that the captain was exactly the person who could end it, but not in the way she desperately hoped. As Linda walked toward the cockpit, Maggie turned back to Sarah with a victorious smile that was absolutely chilling in its cruelty. "Pack up your things, sweetie," she said with false sweetness. "You're about to learn that actions have consequences. Maybe next time you'll think twice before bringing a baby where it doesn't belong and disrupting other people's lives." Sarah felt completely alone and helpless. She looked down at Miguel, still sleeping peacefully in her arms, completely unaware that his mere existence had become the center of a battle he never asked to be part of. The other passengers were watching with a mixture of sympathy and uncomfortable silence, but no one else seemed willing to become Maggie's next target. "Don't worry," Sarah whispered to her sleeping son, her voice barely audible. "Daddy will fix this somehow. Daddy always knows what to do." But how could David help? He was hundreds of miles away in Phoenix, probably preparing for his own international flight, completely unaware of the nightmare his wife and newborn son were experiencing at 30,000 feet. Linda returned from the cockpit with Captain Rodriguez, a stern-looking man in his 50s who had clearly been flying long enough to deal with every conceivable type of passenger problem. His uniform was crisp, his bearing professional, and his expression suggested he was not someone who enjoyed being pulled into cabin disputes. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to making life-and-death decisions in the cockpit. Maggie immediately launched into her demands again, this time with even more dramatic flair and righteous indignation. "Captain, I need you to remove this passenger and her disruptive infant from the aircraft immediately. As a Gold Premier member, I expect certain standards to be maintained, and this situation is completely unacceptable." Captain Rodriguez looked at Sarah and Miguel, then back at Maggie's flushed, angry face. "Ma'am, I see a sleeping baby and a quiet mother. What exactly is the disruption you're referring to?" "It's going to cry," Maggie insisted with absolute certainty. "Babies that young always cry on planes. It's going to ruin the flight for everyone. I'm not going to pay hundreds of dollars to listen to screaming for 3 hours." The captain looked around at the other passengers, seeking input from the people who had actually witnessed the situation. Has the baby been crying or causing any disturbance? Several people shook their heads. Colonel Patterson spoke up clearly, Captain, the baby has been perfectly quiet since boarding. This lady has been the only one causing any disturbance. Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly, and Sarah felt a moment of hope. Surely he would see reason and put an end to this nightmare. But then Maggie played her trump card with the confidence of someone who had used connections and influence to get her way her entire life. Captain, I need you to understand something very important, she said, lowering her voice to sound more reasonable while her eyes remained cold and calculating. I'm not just a Gold Premier member. I'm Margaret Thompson. My husband Frank owns Thompson Development. We build half the resort properties in Phoenix and Scottsdale. We have extensive connections with the airport authority, the tourism board, and several airline executives. If this situation isn't handled properly, it won't just be a customer complaint. It will become a serious business problem for this airline. Sarah watched in horror as the captain's expression changed. She could practically see him calculating in his head, one young mother with a baby versus someone with powerful connections and the ability to cause real problems for the airline and potentially his own career. I'm sorry, he said to Sarah, not meeting her eyes because he knew what he was about to do was wrong. I'm going to have to ask you to take the next available flight. We'll arrange for you to be rebooked at no additional charge. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. But my baby isn't doing anything wrong. He's been perfectly quiet. I understand, ma'am, but sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the comfort and safety of all passengers. The comfort of all passengers? Colonel Patterson stood up again, his voice ringing with moral authority. Captain, you're removing a quiet baby and his mother to please one complaining woman. That's not maintaining comfort, that's discrimination. Sir, please take your seat. This decision has been made and is final. What happened next would haunt Sarah for months to come. As she slowly gathered her diaper bag, Miguel's blanket, and her few belongings, other passengers began to react with a mixture of emotions. Some looked away, embarrassed by the injustice they were witnessing but unwilling to get involved. Others shook their heads in disgust, but whether at her situation or at Maggie's behavior, Sarah couldn't tell. Come on, sweetie, Maggie said with fake sympathy as Sarah stood up with Miguel in her arms. Maybe you'll think twice before flying with a baby next time. This is a lesson that will serve you well in the future. Sarah's legs felt like they were made of rubber as she walked down the narrow aisle toward the front of the plane. Every step was agony, not physical pain, but the deep, burning shame of being publicly humiliated and rejected when she had done absolutely nothing wrong. Miguel had done nothing wrong. But they were being marched off the plane like criminals, all because one person had complained loudly enough. As they reached the front of the aircraft, Miguel woke up from his peaceful sleep. Not crying, not fussing, not causing any of the disruption Maggie had predicted, just opening his beautiful dark eyes and looking around with the innocent curiosity of a newborn experiencing the world. Look at that, Sarah heard Maggie announce loudly behind them for the entire plane to hear. Now it's awake. See, I told you this would happen. I saved everyone from hours of screaming and disruption. But Miguel didn't scream. He didn't even whimper. He just looked up at his mother with those trusting dark eyes that reminded her so much of David, as if to say, "It's okay, Mama. We'll be fine together." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she walked off the plane, carrying the most precious cargo in the world. The gate agents were apologetic but offered little real comfort beyond procedure. They could rebook her on the next available flight, but it wouldn't depart for another 6 long hours. 6 hours alone in an airport with a 3-week-old baby, feeling like she had failed as a mother before her son was even a month old. As she sat in the hard plastic chair at the gate, gently feeding Miguel from a bottle while other travelers rushed past them, Sarah felt completely defeated. She pulled out her phone to call David, but what could she say? How could she explain that their perfect, innocent son had been kicked off a plane simply for existing? She decided to send a text message instead. Flight delayed. Will call you later. Love you both. She couldn't bear to tell him the truth. Not yet. Not until she could find the words to explain the inexplicable. Meanwhile, back on the plane, an uncomfortable silence had settled over the passengers like a heavy blanket. Maggie had returned to her seat with a satisfied smile, congratulating herself on what she considered a victory for common sense and passenger rights. Well, that sorted out nicely, she announced to anyone within hearing distance. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself and speak out against inconsiderate behavior. If we all just accepted every inconvenience that selfish people impose on us, the world would be complete chaos. But her declared victory felt hollow and wrong to everyone else who had witnessed the scene. The passengers who had seen a quiet baby and his loving mother humiliated and removed from the plane were processing what they had just witnessed, an act of casual cruelty disguised as righteous indignation. Colonel Patterson was particularly disturbed by what he had seen. His name was George Patterson, and he was traveling to Phoenix to meet his own new grandchild for the first time. What he had witnessed felt deeply personal and morally wrong. "That was completely unjust," he said quietly to his wife Helen, who was sitting beside him. "That young woman and her baby did nothing to deserve that treatment." Helen nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "That poor baby. That poor mother. I can't believe they actually made her leave the plane. What kind of world are we living in?" Around the aircraft, similar conversations were happening in hushed tones. A young father traveling with his own toddler felt sick to his stomach, wondering if the same thing could happen to his family. A businesswoman who had been planning to complain about crying children herself now felt deeply ashamed of the thought. But Maggie continued to bask in the attention, interpreting the uncomfortable silence as validation of her actions rather than the moral disgust it actually represented. "You know," she said to her husband Frank, who had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, "more people need to speak up like I do. Everyone's always complaining about crying babies on planes, but nobody actually does anything about it. I took real action to solve the problem." Frank, who had been married to Maggie for 20 long years, said nothing in response. He had learned through bitter experience that disagreeing with his wife in public only made situations worse. But privately he was deeply ashamed. He had watched a young mother be humiliated and had done nothing to stop it, nothing to stand up for what was right. As the plane taxied toward the runway for takeoff, none of the passengers knew that in the cockpit, a very different and much more serious conversation was taking place. Captain Rodriguez was methodically running through his pre-flight checklist when his co-pilot, Jake Morrison, brought up the incident that was weighing heavily on both their minds. "That situation back there was really rough, Captain," Jake said carefully. "That young woman with the baby, she seemed genuinely devastated. And the baby really was perfectly quiet the whole time." Rodriguez sighed heavily, a sound that carried the weight of 25 years of flying and the burden of difficult decisions. "Yeah, it wasn't ideal by any stretch. But sometimes you have to make tough calls to maintain order and keep the peace among passengers." "Did you happen to catch her name on the passenger manifest?" Jake asked, something nagging at the back of his mind. Rodriguez pulled up the passenger list on his tablet computer. "Let's see. Sarah Martinez. Why do you ask?" Jake frowned as a memory surfaced. "Martinez? Wasn't there a Captain Martinez flying the Phoenix to Tokyo route today? I thought I saw it on the crew scheduling board." Rodriguez scrolled through his scheduling application, and his expression began to change. "Yeah, David Martinez is flying the 787 to Tokyo this evening. He's scheduled for departure at 8 p.m. Why do you? Oh no." The realization hit both experienced pilots at exactly the same time, like a punch to the gut. "Same last name," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with growing dread. "Could be a coincidence," Rodriguez said, but his voice completely lacked conviction. Jake pulled out his phone and accessed the company directory. As pilots, they had access to personnel information for coordination purposes. It took him only 30 seconds to find David Martinez's employee profile. Another 30 seconds to locate David's emergency contact information. "Captain," Jake said, his voice tight with horror, "David Martinez's emergency contact is listed as Sarah Martinez. Same phone number as the passenger we just had removed from the aircraft." Rodriguez felt his stomach drop through the floor of the cockpit. "Dear God. We just kicked a pilot's wife and newborn son off the plane." "Not just any pilot," Jake said, continuing to read through David's impressive profile. "Senior Captain David Martinez. 15 years with the company. Spotless safety record, commendations for training excellence. He's one of the senior pilots who trains new captains." Rodriguez closed his eyes and felt the full weight of what he had done. In his 25 years of flying commercial aircraft, he had made thousands of difficult decisions. But this one was about to become the worst mistake of his entire career. "What do we do now?" Jake asked quietly. Rodriguez looked at his instruments, checked their position in the takeoff queue, and considered their options. They were third in line for departure. The passengers were settled and ready for flight, the flight attendants were preparing the cabin for takeoff, and air traffic control was expecting them to depart on schedule. "We complete this flight," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. But the moment we land in Phoenix, I'm calling David Martinez personally to apologize and explain what happened. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 6 hours later, after what felt like the longest day of her life, Sarah finally boarded the evening flight to Phoenix. Miguel had been absolutely perfect throughout the entire day, sleeping peacefully, eating when hungry, and charming every gate agent and airline employee who had taken pity on their situation. Several passengers from the morning flight had approached her during the long layover to express their outrage at how she had been treated. "That woman was completely out of line," one businesswoman had said with genuine anger. "Your baby was an absolute angel. I cannot believe they actually made you get off the plane. It was disgraceful." By the time Sarah's delayed flight finally touched down in Phoenix, she was emotionally and physically exhausted, dreading the conversation she would inevitably have to have with David. How do you tell your husband that his precious son was kicked off an airplane simply for existing? David was waiting at the arrival gate with the biggest, most loving smile Sarah had ever seen on his handsome face. He looked incredibly professional and attractive in his crisp pilot's uniform, and she could see the immense pride and joy in his dark eyes as he looked at his wife and son. "They are my two favorite people in the entire world," he said warmly, wrapping both of them in a gentle, protective hug. "How was your first flight together? I've been thinking about you both all day." Sarah immediately burst into tears. Hey, what's wrong?" David asked, his expression immediately shifting to concern as he studied his wife's face. "Is Miguel okay? Are you okay? What happened?" Through her sobs and broken words, Sarah told him everything. About Maggie's unreasonable complaints and cruel personal attacks, about the humiliation of being stared at by other passengers, about being forced to leave the plane while people watched like she was some kind of criminal. As the story unfolded in painful detail, David's expression changed from concern to confusion to barely controlled anger. "They kicked you off the plane?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet in the way that people who knew him understood meant he was furious. "They actually kicked my wife and 3-week-old son off a plane because some entitled woman complained about a baby who wasn't even crying?" "I'm so sorry," Sarah said through her tears. "I should have stood up to her more forcefully. I should have demanded to speak to someone in authority. I should have." "No," David said firmly, his voice filled with protective love. "You did absolutely nothing wrong. Miguel did nothing wrong. This is not your fault, and I won't let you blame yourself for 1 second." He immediately pulled out his phone and called his direct supervisor, Tom Stevens. "Tom, it's David Martinez. I need to know the specific details of an incident on Flight 447 from Chicago this morning." "Yes, I'll hold while you look it up." While he waited on hold, David's mind was racing with anger and disbelief. He knew Captain Rodriguez personally, they had flown together on several occasions and had always maintained a professional relationship. Rodriguez was generally considered a competent pilot, but David also knew he was someone who avoided confrontation and difficult situations whenever possible. "Tom? Yeah, I'm still here. What do you mean, what incident?" "My wife and newborn son were removed from the aircraft this morning." "What? No, there was absolutely no disturbance from the baby. Are you seriously telling me this right now?" Sarah watched her husband's face turn red with anger as he listened to the company's official version of events, which apparently differed significantly from reality. "Tom, let me be very clear about something," David said, his voice controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge. "My 3-week-old son and my wife were humiliated and removed from a plane they had every legal right to be on. And if this situation isn't made right immediately, it's going to become a very serious problem for everyone involved. Yes, I'll definitely be in your office first thing tomorrow morning." The next morning, the conference room at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport felt tense and uncomfortable. David sat across from Tom Stevens, the regional operations manager, while Captain Rodriguez sat at the end of the table looking like he wished he could disappear. "David, I want you to know that we're taking this situation very seriously," Tom began, his tone suggesting he understood the gravity of what had occurred. "Are you really?" David asked pointedly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you removed paying passengers from an aircraft to appease one complaining customer. And those passengers happened to be my family." Captain Rodriguez finally found the courage to speak. "David, I want to sincerely apologize. I made what I thought was a judgment call in a very difficult situation, and I realize now that it was completely the wrong decision." "A judgment call?" David's voice was ice cold. "Carlos, help me understand this particular judgment call." A 3-week-old baby who wasn't crying, wasn't causing any disturbance, was removed from an aircraft because one passenger complained loudly enough. Is that really the standard we're setting for passenger treatment? There were threats of complaints, potential negative media attention, concerns about. So we're removing innocent passengers based on threats now? Based on what might happen rather than what actually is happening. Tom pulled out his tablet computer. David, I've thoroughly reviewed all the incident reports, passenger statements, and the complete passenger manifest. I've also personally spoken with several passengers who were on that flight. He turned the screen toward David. 12 passengers have filed formal complaints about the incident. 11 of them are complaining specifically about how your wife was treated. They're calling it discriminatory, humiliating, and completely unjustified. And the 12th complaint? Margaret Thompson, who, it turns out, has filed 23 separate complaints with various airlines in just the past 2 years alone. She's what our customer service department classifies as a frequent complainer, someone who consistently finds problems regardless of the actual service provided. David leaned back in his chair, processing this information. So you removed my family from a plane to appease someone who complains about everything, while completely ignoring the fact that my son was perfectly behaved and hadn't caused any actual problems. We also reviewed the aircraft's internal audio recording system, Tom continued. In the 47 minutes your wife and son were on board, your son made exactly 3 audible sounds. All of them were what our contracted child psychology consultant described as completely normal newborn vocalizations. No crying, no screaming, no disturbance of any kind. Rodriguez looked absolutely miserable. David, I made a terrible mistake. I let her intimidate me into making a decision that went against everything I believe in. I'm truly sorry. Sorry isn't going to fix what you did to my wife, David said bluntly. Do you have any idea what it was like for her? A new mother, alone with a baby, being told she doesn't belong on a plane? Being walked off like some kind of criminal while passengers stared at her? She's been questioning herself as a mother because of what happened. Tom nodded gravely. Which is exactly why we're prepared to take significant action to make this situation right. What kind of action are we talking about? David asked skeptically. Tom opened an official-looking folder. First, a complete refund of your wife's original ticket, plus substantial additional compensation for the emotional distress and humiliation she experienced. Second, a formal written apology from the airline's executive team. Third, Captain Rodriguez will be attending mandatory additional training on passenger rights, conflict resolution, and non-discriminatory treatment policies. And what about Margaret Thompson? Tom's expression hardened noticeably. Mrs. Thompson has been placed on our company's no-fly list pending a comprehensive review of her behavior pattern. Interestingly, her husband Frank actually called us yesterday to personally apologize for his wife's actions and specifically requested that we implement meaningful consequences. David raised an eyebrow in surprise. He requested consequences for his own wife? Apparently he's been embarrassed and ashamed of her behavior for years but never knew how to address it effectively. When he witnessed the pain and humiliation she caused your wife and realized that his silence made him complicit, something changed in him. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "My wife needs to learn that actions have real consequences, and maybe facing some herself will help her become a better person." Rodriguez leaned forward earnestly. David, I know this doesn't undo what happened, but I want you to understand that what I did goes against everything I believe in as a pilot, as a leader, and as a human being. Your wife and son deserved so much better than what they received. David studied Rodriguez's face for a long moment. Carlos, you and I have flown together multiple times. I know you're not fundamentally a bad person. But what you did to my family was wrong on every conceivable level, and it can never be allowed to happen again to any family. It won't, Rodriguez promised solemnly. I give you my word as a pilot and as a man. Tom closed the folder and pulled out another document. There's one more thing, David. We've conducted a thorough review of Mrs. Thompson's complete travel history with our airline. She flies this Chicago-Phoenix route frequently because she owns a timeshare property in Scottsdale. But here's the remarkable part, she has literally never completed a single flight without filing some kind of formal complaint. What do you mean by that? Every single flight, without exception, she finds something to complain about. Crying babies, loud passengers, cold food, warm drinks, slow service, fast service, seat assignments, overhead bin space, literally everything imaginable. She systematically uses complaints as a weapon to get free upgrades, refunds, vouchers, and special treatment. David felt his anger rising again. So she's essentially a professional complainer who games the system, and you still chose to believe her complaints over my family's right to travel? That's exactly why this situation is so serious and why we're taking such comprehensive action, Tom replied. We failed your family because we didn't do our due diligence. We simply reacted to the loudest, most aggressive voice instead of looking at the actual facts and treating all passengers with equal dignity. Tom pulled out one final document. Which brings me to our last proposal. We'd like to offer your wife a position as a passenger experience consultant. She would help us train our staff on how to handle sensitive situations like this properly and ensure that no other family ever goes through what yours did. David was genuinely surprised. You're offering Sarah a job? She has a background in customer service, correct? And after what she experienced, she understands better than anyone how passengers should be treated with dignity and respect. It would be part-time, completely flexible around caring for Miguel, and it would help ensure that her terrible experience leads to positive changes that benefit other families. That evening, David sat with Sarah in their comfortable living room, Miguel sleeping peacefully in his bassinet between them. He had explained everything from the meeting, the sincere apologies, the financial compensation, and the unexpected job offer. They want me to work for the airline? Sarah asked, still processing everything she had heard. Only if you want to and only on your terms, David assured her. Tom said they really need someone who truly understands the passenger perspective. Someone who's actually experienced what you went through. Sarah looked down at Miguel, her beautiful sleeping baby boy. I keep thinking about other mothers who might go through the same humiliation and discrimination. What if they don't have a husband who's a pilot to advocate for them? What if they don't have anyone to stand up for them? That's exactly why they want you on the team, David said supportively. You could help prevent this from happening to other families. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the possibilities. What about Margaret Thompson? What's happening to her? David smiled with grim satisfaction. That's actually the best part of this whole situation. She's been completely banned from the airline. But here's the really interesting part. It turns out her own husband was so embarrassed and ashamed by what she did to you that he actually personally requested the ban. He did what? Apparently, Frank Thompson told the airline executives that he was tired of being married to someone who made other people miserable everywhere they went. He said that maybe if she faced some real, meaningful consequences for her cruel behavior, she might finally learn to treat people with basic human respect. Sarah felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She didn't particularly enjoy seeing families torn apart, but she also couldn't forget the calculated cruelty in Margaret's eyes as she had demanded that an innocent newborn baby be removed from the plane. I think I want to take the job, Sarah said finally, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Are you absolutely sure? Sarah looked at her precious sleeping son. Miguel deserves to grow up in a world where babies and families are welcomed and supported, not treated like inconveniences or disruptions. If I can help make that happen even in some small way, then maybe what we went through will have served a meaningful purpose. 3 months later, Sarah Martinez sat in the Phoenix Sky Harbor Training Center, confidently leading a comprehensive seminar for flight attendants, gate agents and customer service representatives on passenger sensitivity, conflict resolution and family-friendly policies. The most important thing to remember, she told her engaged audience, is that every single passenger has a story, a reason for traveling, and deserves to be treated with dignity. That mother with the crying baby might be traveling to see a dying relative. That elderly man complaining about his seat assignment might be in physical pain. That businessman who seems rude and demanding might be under enormous stress about keeping his job. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a beautiful photograph of Miguel, now a happy, healthy 6-month-old baby with his father's dark eyes and his mother's gentle smile. When my son and I were removed from Flight 447 6 months ago, it wasn't because we had done anything wrong or caused any actual problems. It was because one passenger's loud complaints were given more weight than our fundamental rights as paying customers. The staff members involved made their decision based on fear of complaints, fear of negative publicity, fear of confrontation, rather than on facts, fairness, or basic human decency. A young flight attendant raised her hand with a question. But what should we do if a passenger really is being disruptive or causing legitimate problems? Then you address the actual disruption with appropriate, proportional responses, Sarah explained clearly. But in our case there was no disruption whatsoever. There was only the assumption and fear that there might be a problem at some point in the future. We were punished and humiliated for something that never happened and likely never would have happened. After the seminar concluded, Sarah walked through the busy terminal to meet David for lunch. As she passed gate A7, the same gate where she had been stranded and humiliated 6 months earlier, she noticed a young mother struggling with a fussy, overtired toddler. Are you okay? Sarah asked kindly, approaching the obviously stressed woman. I'm so sorry, the mother said, looking embarrassed and overwhelmed. He's usually such a good traveler, but he's tired and hungry and I can't seem to find anywhere quiet where I can feed him properly. Sarah smiled with genuine warmth and understanding. Please don't apologize. You're doing an amazing job. Would you like me to show you where the family room is? It's quiet, private, and has comfortable chairs for nursing. As she helped guide the grateful mother and child to a better location, Sarah felt a profound sense of purpose that she had never experienced before. This was exactly what she was meant to do: help other parents navigate the challenges and difficulties of traveling with children, ensuring they were treated with respect rather than judgment. Her terrible experience was becoming something positive and meaningful. 2 years after the incident that changed everything, Sarah received a phone call from Tom Stevens with news that completed the circle of accountability and justice. "Sarah, I have some information I thought you'd want to hear about," Tom said. "What's happening? Remember Captain Rodriguez? The pilot who made the decision to remove you from the flight." Sarah felt a familiar tension. "Yes, I remember him. He's being promoted to Chief of Flight Operations for the entire Western region. But here's what makes this significant. He specifically requested that comprehensive passenger sensitivity training become mandatory for all flight crews, gate agents, and customer service staff. He told the executive committee that what happened to your family should never be allowed to happen to anyone else, ever." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected development. "He requested the mandatory training? More than that. He wants your case to be used as the primary teaching example in the training program. With your permission, of course. He believes that by sharing what happened to you and Miguel, we can prevent similar incidents and create a more inclusive, family-friendly travel environment." Sarah thought about Rodriguez, the man whose poor decision had created one of the worst days of her life. She considered second chances, redemption, personal growth, and the power of learning from serious mistakes. "Yes," she said finally. "You have my permission to use our story." The following week, Sarah found herself in a large conference room with Captain Rodriguez, addressing a room full of pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and senior management from across the airline system. "2 years ago," Rodriguez began, his voice heavy with genuine remorse, "I made a decision that I will regret for the rest of my career and my life. I removed a passenger and her 3-week-old baby from an aircraft, not because they had done anything wrong or caused any problems, but because I was afraid of dealing with one difficult, demanding passenger who made loud threats." He gestured respectfully toward Sarah. "Mrs. Martinez and her innocent son paid the price for my cowardice and poor judgment. They were humiliated, discriminated against, and treated as if their rights and dignity didn't matter." Sarah stood up to address the room. "What Captain Rodriguez did was absolutely wrong, and it caused real harm to my family. But what matters more now is what we've all learned from that experience. We've learned that every passenger deserves to be treated with fundamental dignity and respect. We've learned that babies and families have just as much right to travel as anyone else. And we've learned that making decisions based on fear and intimidation rather than facts and fairness leads inevitably to injustice." She looked around the room at the attentive faces. "I want each of you to remember that when you're dealing with traveling families, you're not just managing passengers or handling logistics, you're protecting and caring for someone's most precious cargo, their reason for living." The changes that began with one cruel woman's complaint and one mother's humiliation continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted. Margaret Thompson's behavior had inadvertently sparked a transformation in how the airline industry treated families with children. Under Rodriguez's leadership, the airline implemented some of the most progressive, family-friendly policies in the entire industry. They created special family boarding areas, provided additional training for staff on assisting traveling families, and established clear guidelines protecting passengers from discrimination based on age or family status. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself, who had transformed her personal pain into professional purpose. 10 years after that terrible day on Flight 447, Sarah Martinez stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., receiving recognition from the Federal Aviation Administration for her contributions to passenger rights and family-friendly air travel policies. In her acceptance speech, she said, "10 years ago, my 3-week-old son and I were removed from an airplane because one passenger complained loudly about a baby who wasn't even crying. It was a moment of pure injustice that could have filled me with permanent bitterness and anger." She paused, looking out at an audience that included Margaret Thompson, who had eventually found her own path to redemption through volunteer work, Captain Rodriguez, and dozens of airline employees who had been trained in the program Sarah had developed. But instead, That terrible moment became the foundation for changes that have made air travel better and more welcoming for millions of families. It taught me that our worst experiences can become our greatest teachers, and that the people who initially hurt us can sometimes become our most valuable allies in creating positive change. Miguel, now 15 years old and interested in following his father into aviation, watched proudly from the audience as his mother concluded her speech. The lesson I want to leave you with is this: when someone shows you cruelty, you face a choice. You can respond with more cruelty, creating an endless cycle of pain, or you can respond with justice and work to prevent others from experiencing what you did. You can let bitterness consume and destroy you, or you can let it transform you into someone who fights for what's right. She smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought her to this moment. 10 years ago, a woman named Margaret Thompson made a choice to be cruel to my family. But in the end, she also made a different choice, the choice to change, to grow, to become better. And that second choice, the choice to learn and transform rather than remain bitter and cruel, that's the choice that truly matters and creates lasting positive change. As the ceremony ended, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with such pain and humiliation. Miguel Martinez, the baby who had once been kicked off a plane simply for existing, was now a teenager with dreams of becoming a pilot himself. In a few years, he would be flying planes full of families, ensuring that every passenger, no matter how small, no matter how young, would be treated with the dignity, respect, and kindness his mother had fought to establish. The story that began with cruelty had become a lasting legacy of compassion, proving that sometimes the world really does change one person, one choice, and one act of grace at a time.